Hi everyone, I hope you're well. Thanks so much for joining me, and I do appreciate your time and support. The last two videos I covered RAW versus JPEG and RAW only shooting. In this video I'll be discussing film simulation, so a large part of this talk is around JPEG only shooting, but there is a RAW component as well. And I'm hoping that this video, as well as the last two videos, give you an overall better picture of what you can achieve with your camera, at least how to set it up correctly to achieve the results you want. There's a lot of information around this topic, so I'll divide it into three parts. The first part, I'm going to discuss the camera itself and the settings and what they do in camera. In the second part, I'm going to talk about JPEGs that are being processed by your camera. Now, there's two parts to that. You can produce it directly in camera at the time of shooting, or you can connect your camera to the computer and use software in combination with the processor in your camera to produce JPEGs. And finally, I'll discuss shooting RAW, taking your images into post-production software and using film simulations there. Profiles are not unique to Fujifilm. You find them in every digital camera. Now, whether it's the live feed coming into your EVF or the LCD or their playback, which is a JPEG preview, they look the way they do because of the profile and the settings that you've set in camera. What makes Fujifilm unique with their profiles is that they've gone out and created film simulations as profiles to sort of mimic or copy films that Fujifilm have made throughout the years. They're, their most popular films. So here they've deliberately gone with a look that they know very well, that has a history, has a following. So it's not just a generic profile. There's a lot of character to it. And this is really one of the biggest draw cards for Fujifilm. There's so many people that get into the Fujifilm system or X system for the film simulations. I have a history with film. I used to shoot professionally on film. Even before I was doing weddings and portraiture, I was doing landscapes on Velvia. So I know these films very, very well. So it was interesting to see them take this approach. Now, have they got them exactly, or do they look exactly the same as film? No, they don't. There's no ways you're going to be able to get a digital image to look like film. Film is very unique. So is a digital image unique. But they got them very, very close. And I'm very, very impressed. Looking at Velvia, for example, which I've shot a ton of. Velvia is a very unforgiving film. It's notoriously unforgiving. It's very contrasty, deep blacks, deep shadows. At the same time, pushing certain colors, making them very punchy. So not very forgiving, not much latitude in that. So when you go and look at the actual Velvia digital image, so when you take an image and you apply that film simulation and you go look at the histogram, for example, you see the same characteristics. You see the histogram pushing out, showing a lot of sort of crushed blacks and highlights, very contrasty. And in a way is less forgiving than another film simulation like a Turner, which is a flatter profile, which is a more sort of mid-tone profile, less sort of blacks and highlights, sort of keeping everything more in the middle of the histogram. As a RAW only shooter, which I discussed in my last video, I've still got to be very aware of film simulations, because whether I like it or not, whether I shoot RAW or JPEG, that film simulation still has an impact on my image. Now, I discussed in RAW how it impacts the histogram, but not only that, when you import the image into your post-production software, it applies that profile. That's the image you're looking at. Or Adobe applies its profile. So you're always dealing with a profile of some kind. So whether it's Fujifilm or a different brand, that profile that you set has an impact on that image when it comes into post-production. There is always a profile associated with the preview that's generated from the raw information. So I think it's important that those of you who are RAW only shooters understand film simulations as well. But looking at film simulation from a JPEG perspective, I've learned a lot over the last 2 weeks. I thought I knew a lot about my camera and I thought I knew a lot about JPEGs, and I do to a degree, but it was quite interesting. Delving a little bit deeper into processing JPEGs in the camera and so on, I've learned quite a bit. I've done a lot of research. I've gone and looked at other YouTube videos. I've done my best not to regurgitate the same information. And I was surprised how much wrong information there is out there on the subject. Just, just incorrect information, and it's then regurgitated over and over in other videos. I'm hoping that I can be as accurate as possible in giving you the right information. I don't know everything about the processing power of your camera and how it processes the image, but I can kind of give you an idea of which way Fujifilm goes and sort of ideas that you may use to improve the JPEGs that come out of your camera, or the way you handle raw images in post-production software with those film simulations. So when we talk about film simulation and settings in camera, just remember that you may have an older generation of Fujifilm X series cameras. And some of the things I talk about in the settings may not actually be in your camera. Now, that could be due to two different reasons. You could have maybe not updated your camera, because sometimes new features that are added to new cameras do then get added to previous generations through updates, firmware updates, but sometimes they're just excluded altogether. Now, the vast majority of the settings I'm talking about are actually in your cameras all the way going back to the X-T1 or the X Pro 1. But just bear in mind, if you don't see some of the settings I'm talking about, it's because of the generation of your camera. I'm not going to discuss every film simulation and tell you my favorite, or tell you how they compare to one another and how closely they resemble the film that they've been inspired from. I would say just go onto their website, have a look. There's a lot of write-ups on each simulation. You can look at samples and what samples look like. You can even, use your own camera if you own a Fujifilm camera, and you can just, look at the live preview, go through each simulation and see the effect that it has. But I would say that it's not simply a color difference between each simulation. More importantly, there's a tonal difference in the way that simulation handles tonal values. What it does with the blacks, the midtones, and the highlights in the image, and how they can quite radically differ between each simulation. That's an important aspect of simulation that you've got to sort of get your head around and understand what each simulation gives you in relation to the tonal values. Presently, Fujifilm has 11 simulations on its latest cameras. Out of the 11 simulations, you have 2 black and white simulations, acros and monochrome, and they themselves have an additional 3 filters, color filters per simulation. So what color filters do to black and white, like they did on black and white film, is that depending on the color you use, it allows certain color light to pass through and holds back certain color light from coming through. So you can dramatically change an image depending on what you're shooting and what color you use. So you can darken blue skies, you can have different effects, all done with putting a filter in front of that black and white simulation. If you're planning on using a black and white simulation like monochrome or acros, you can actually tint it. Very much like the white balance shift adjustment that you get in white balance. In camera and or in software, whether it be the RAW converter or the Xraw Studio, you can actually use the monochromatic color adjustment. So when you select that, it brings up a panel of color and you can tint your black and white image accordingly. So you can warm it up, cool it down, whatever it might be. I'm not a huge fan of this myself. I prefer just your black and white image, your monochromatic look. But yeah, there's quite a lot you can do with your black and white images. Fujifilm added a grain effect setting on their simulation. Now, not to get confused between grain and noise, and I know a lot of people use those words interchangeably. Noise is found in digital photography. When you apply gain or you raise your ISO, you get noise. When you shot with fast film or high ISO film, 1600, 800, or even 400 film, you got grain. Now, when I was shooting film, you try to avoid getting too much grain. You would use different techniques. You might even shoot at a lower speed film and then push processes. There was numerous ways of trying to avoid a lot of grain when you're shooting in low light situations. But today, I think it's become quite popular to see a little bit of grain there. It kind of gives you that nostalgic look. Obviously, you've got to be careful that you don't overuse it. And obviously, if you're shooting JPEG only, not a RAW image as well as a JPEG, you're baking that into the image, and that's going to be part of the image whether you like it or not. So just be careful when you use something like that. But I think it's very cool, and the times that I have tested it, it actually does give you quite a realistic grain effect, which is pretty cool. With the grain effect, you have a couple of different options. You have the choice of weak or strong, and you have the choice of the size of grain that you want to use. So you can use either a small or a large size grain. So in this situation, I've chosen large. As you can see, the effect is quite apparent, quite a strong look. But let me just turn it off so you can see what it looks like without the grain effect. Fujifilm have added 2 chrome effects to their more recent release of cameras. One is color chrome effect, and the other one is a color chrome FX blue. Now, to be quite honest, when I looked at these different effects and I actually applied them to certain images, very subtle, very, very, very subtle. Some of the images I couldn't even see the difference. Very difficult to see it on your preview. Now, a common problem with digital photography when you're out and about, particularly when you're doing, scenes that are quite vibrant and you're using a vibrant simulation or profile, is that you may land up clipping a particular channel. So, when you use a luminosity or an RGB composite histogram, what you're effectively looking at is percentages of color sort of composited or combined together. And quite often, if you're not looking at the color histogram, which is independent channels, you'll miss the clipping of one of the colors. So let's just say, for example, you're photographing a red rose. Well, in that situation, the histogram looks fine, but when you go look at the color channel separately, you'll see red is clipping. And what will happen when you get the image back is that yes, the rose is red and everything looks good, but it's those transitions across the detail in the red rose that are lost and become some one tone. And you lose a lot of that detail because that red clipped. Well, color chrome effect, what it effectively does is it brings back detail into those areas that potentially could clip on independent colors. So it would bring back detail into that rose. It would hold back and control that color in a unique way. So it's something that I got to reiterate. It's quite subtle. You're not going to see it that easily in samples. But if you are shooting in those unique situations and you're creating JPEGs in camera, because remember, something like a chrome effect is not found in post-production software. This is unique to shooting a JPEG in camera. I would use those effects because any bit of detail you can get back in these potentially clipped areas and colors, I think is very, very important. Color Chrome Effects Blue is a setting that adjusts blue in the photograph. Now, for example, if you're photographing a scene with a big blue sky and you wanted to sort of make the blue a little bit more intense, a little bit deeper, you would apply this setting. Now, from what I can tell, I tried to apply it to a few of my images. A very subtle change. It's a very subtle adjustment. What I can tell is not so much a saturation change or a vibrance or vivid change. It's a luminance change. So it's making the blue deeper as opposed to darker and deeper as opposed to sort of more vibrant or vivid. Again, it's quite subtle. But if you were, in a scene where, for example, you had a big blue sky, but the actual blue in the sky was pretty pale, and the only way you could sort of deepen that blue or darken that blue is underexposing the image. Now, when you're creating a JPEG, and obviously you have, limited control over your tonal areas when it comes to actually producing that JPEG in camera, you don't want to be underexposing too much because you don't want to be, darkening the shadows to the point where you can't recover them. So in a way, this setting allows you to deepen that blue without having to underexpose the image. But again, it's pretty subtle, and you do have two adjustments with this setting. The next setting is white balance. Now, I know most of you already know what white balance is. It's color temperature. Just bear in mind that when you're shooting JPEG only, that white balance is baked in when it creates that JPEG image, that compressed 8-bit image. So when it comes to post-production on that JPEG, if you ever had to try and adjust it, you have very little latitude there. Whereas if you were shooting a 14-bit RAW, you could change white balance as if you were changing it on the day shooting. Very, very powerful. So that's why when you're shooting RAW, you don't have to be as accurate. You don't have to be as aware and consciously aware of your white balance. Where if you're going to be using recipes and custom sort of profiles that you set up for yourself in your camera, which I'll discuss later, you've got to be aware that that's a set white balance. And it's not, you might have set it up as auto. That's fine. It'll keep adjusting for you. But if you make a recipe and it has a particular white balance in it, you've got to be aware of that, and you've got to constantly keep changing it. So you'd have to train yourself if you're shooting JPEG only just to be watching your white balance. Now, within white balance, you can customize and save profiles of white balances. You can also set up your own through adjusting Kelvin manually, or you can go to the pre-selected ones like daylight and tungsten and so on, or auto, where the camera works it out for you and does a very good job working it out for you. So yeah, powerful tool, white balance, especially when it comes to white balance shift. And we'll discuss that as well when we discuss recipes. White balance shifting can really create powerful looks and unique looks to your JPEG images processed in camera. Probably one of the less spoken about and most misunderstood settings around simulations is dynamic range. This has been implemented to improve the dynamic range on the JPEG image that gets processed in your camera. It's not there to improve the dynamic range on your RAW image. Cannot do that. Now, there's a lot of misinformation and misguided information around dynamic range and RAW, saying, listen, you can see it has an impact on this RAW image. It has increased its dynamic range. If you are watching those videos and seeing that information, just pause for a second and understand exactly what people are showing you. The difference between DR100 and DR200 is 1 stop. The difference between DR100 and DR400 is 2 stops. So for you to avail of the benefit of a 2-stop increase in dynamic range, you have to shoot at least 2 stops higher in ISO gain than your base RAW ISO. If you're shooting manually, you have to set it manually 2 stops above to get the DR400 to work. Or if you're in auto ISO shooting a priority mode, automatically, like if you were in DR100, for example, and you were shooting happily away at 160 ISO on the X-T4, as soon as you change to DR400, the camera bumps that up to 640, which is 2 stops. So what exactly is happening to your raw images when you start adjusting DR settings in camera? Well, I've taken 3 shots, all with the same shutter settings, all with the same aperture setting, and all using the same lens. I've kind of framed them very similar. It was handheld, so it's not exactly the same. All the same white balance and all using the same film simulation. Now in the second and third shot, I pushed out the ISO to 640. Now remember, I'm demonstrating DR100 and DR400. You cannot avail of DR400 unless you push the ISO at least by 2 stops. So the first image is 160, the second image is 640, and the third image is 640. Now in this first image I'm showing you here, this is how I would go about exposing this shot. As you've learned from my previous video where I spoke on shoot to edit or raw shooting only, I've exposed to the right. I pushed everything on the histogram, as you can see on the top right hand side, all the way to the right without exiting, so I know that all my highlights, particularly in the sky, are all intact. But obviously by not going further than that, I have crushed some of my sort of black or shadow areas in the scene, those crevices between the boulders and so on. A lot of detail has been lost there, but that's not really an issue for me. I would be more concerned about preserving my highlights than worrying about those deep shadows between those boulders. All right, in the second image, which has been shot at an ISO 640, I set the dynamic range settings in this image to DR100. So it actually hasn't changed from the first image to this image. As you can see, it's 2 stops over. Lots of detail in those shadow areas because everything's been pushed to the right. But as you can see on the histogram on the top right there, everything's been shifted outside of the right-hand side of the histogram, meaning I'm clipping my highlights. So everything sort of in those bright areas are really overexposed. Now in the third image, also shot at ISO 640, which is this image, the difference being is that this has been set to DR400. Now looking at the image, the way it loads into Lightroom, they look identical. There's no difference. You can even look at the histogram. It's pretty much the same thing. The framing slightly different between the shots, which might affect a slight difference on the histogram, one having a little bit more foreground than the other, but they're effectively the exact same exposure. It's 2 stops over, your highlights have been clipped, and there's lots of detail in those shadows. So what exactly is happening to these images? Is there any difference? Well, let's go back to the second image, which is the first of the ISO 640 images, and let's start to adjust this. Remember, this is DR100, so I'm bringing this back by 2 stops on the exposure slider. All right, so that's 2 stops. As you can see on the top right-hand side of the scene, I've blown up my highlights. There's even like a weird color shift happening in the blue, maybe even slight banding. Not sure about the banding, but there's certainly tonality issues in that top corner. The details, everything in the foreground and the shadow areas are still okay. Now it's looking, the foreground certainly looking more like the image that was shot at base ISO of 160, but the sky has totally been sort of overexposed. Let's go look at the third image, which is also ISO 640, but was shot at DR400. And let's do the exact same thing. So let's bring back the exposure on the exposure slider by 2 stops. And now you can see a dramatic difference. The sky in this image is intact. The exact same image, shot at ISO 640. So there's clearly something happening to that raw image. The sky looks exactly the same. I bet if I went back to my ISO 160 image, which I will now, they almost look identical. Go back to the 640 one. They're pretty much the exact same shot. So what exactly is happening here? Well, let me just reset this image. This is the third image. What's actually happening here is that the camera is overexposed for the shadow areas. So it's effectively shot your shadows at ISO 640, and that's what you see here. But it's done something really cool, is that it's also embedded in the same image, captured all the highlights in the scene at ISO 160. So in one raw capture, it's effectively got an additional 2 stops added in by holding back your highlights at 160. So, let's look at that again. Bring it back to 2 stops. And you can see that the sky is looking like the image that was shot at base raw ISO of 160. Now, when it comes to JPEG images, what's effectively happening is that the highlights are brought back by 2 stops, but the shadows are maintained at 640. So the JPEG that gets produced in camera probably looks a little bit more like that. And as you can see, that's a high dynamic range image. So the highlights are intact and your shadows are shown as being pushed by 2 stops. So that's the entire scene there. That's what your camera is going to produce when it makes the JPEG. So is there a massive benefit to shooting with these DR settings when shooting RAW, or RAW only, should I say, when you're not producing a JPEG? And the answer is no. And let me explain why. Now, it might appear that there's a benefit in that maybe you should be pushing your ISO by 2 stops and using the setting, but let me go back to the first image, which was shot at base RAW ISO. And very quickly, with very few adjustments, I can just bring down my highlights, push my shadows, maybe just raise it just ever so slightly. I mean, I'm not checking between the two of them. And I just flick between the base RAW ISO shot that I did 160 and the shot that was shot at DR400 at 640. And effectively, they're identical images with just a couple of adjustments. So when you're shooting RAW only, if you've shot at the lowest possible ISO you can, you actually physically can, that maintains the shutter speed that you want and the aperture that you want for the shot. When you go and adjust shadows, especially if you're exposing to the right like I have, and you start pulling back detail in the shadows, it's no difference to if you had pushed it in the camera by raising up your ISO and using DR400. There's no difference, absolutely no difference. So in short, the dynamic range settings in your camera are there for your JPEG images, not your RAW. Now obviously it will have an effect on your RAW image if you're shooting RAW and JPEG, but the intention is to create a good JPEG in camera. So how does one go about using dynamic range settings and processing JPEGs in camera? Well, you first got to decide what look you're after. Do you want a high key look, low key look? Do you want a high dynamic range look where you've got detail in the shadows and the highlights? You've got to decide, because it may not suit you to use these settings. You may want to turn it off totally because you want a particular look. Well, like many of the settings in the Fujifilm system, with your EVF and your LCD, when you adjust dynamic range settings, you actually get a live preview. It's shown through your EVF or your LCD. And the way I do this is I set it up as a function button. So I hit one of the function buttons. As opposed to being in the menu, it's different. It actually comes up with the settings overlaid the actual image that you are photographing. So when you make an adjustment to the DR100, 200 or 400, you see a live effect on your EVF or LCD. So here I'm actually going to edit the image as though it was done in camera because I'm using the Xchrome software. So this is the same as actually processing in camera. Here I've taken an image, I've set it at DR400, it's at 640 ISO, and I've pushed the histogram all the way to the right. So here, this is as bright as the image can get without losing detail in the highlights. Now, obviously, if I adjust from DR400 to DR200 to show you what it would look like, you can see how the highlights start pushing up and overexposing. All right, so I was aware at the time I was shooting in DR400 and I pushed the histogram all the way to the right-hand side. Now, there's so much detail here in the shadows. It's almost too much detail. Like, it wasn't necessary to have it shot at DR400. More than likely, I see this as a DR200 image, and I see this as actually sort of underexposing it by about a stop. So that's how I see the image anyway. I see that it wasn't necessary to show as much detail in those shadows. I wanted them a bit darker. So in the live preview, I would have landed up with this. I would have landed up with rather going with DR200, and here I've obviously brought down the exposure, but in the camera I would have exposed correctly for this look. And obviously you can see if you go to DR100 and you brighten up your highlights even more and maybe bring down the exposure again, but maybe 2/3, you're bringing drama into the scene. It's quite a bit more drama. Obviously now I'm soon going to be discussing highlights and shadows, so that also comes into play as well. But if you shoot it in DR100 with the express intention of making JPEGs afterwards, well, DR400 is not going to be there for you. You can only edit the photo at DR100. But bearing in mind, you have to be 2 stops over. So you've got to make that call whether that's worth it or not. Some images are just better off shot at 160 ISO or 200 ISO, whatever camera you have, and with a DR100, and you make adjustments with your highlights and your shadows. So just play around with it and see what you can get. But a very powerful tool, this dynamic range. And partly because highlights and shadows only go to -2 with the Fujifilm system. In this example here where I shot it at DR400, and this is kind of how it was shot in camera, I was going for a very pastel type look. I wanted a painting type look where you can see it's not very contrasty. I'd probably still bring it down maybe 1/3 keep it at 400. This looks like a painting to me. So you can create really unusual effects. You can also create recipes around this. And yeah, it's just such a powerful tool. Really, really, really powerful.